I'm sorry this followed me home. Your people came after me and my family.
Not my people.
What's this?
Nobody called it in.
A coincidence is a conspiracy of the guilty.
You don't know the monsters and what they do.
Let's find out.
There is one possibility in Lioness Season 3 Episode 5 that could completely change JoE's entire storyline. What if the CIA doesn't rescue JoE at all? What if JoE escapes the Russians before Kyle and the rescue team even reach her? First, that sounds almost impossible. JoE is being held by people who know exactly how valuable she is, and they are not going to simply leave a way out for her. But this is JoE we're talking about. She has spent her entire career surviving situations where the odds were completely against her. And the more I think about her captivity, the more I believe the Russians may make one huge mistake. They may believe that keeping JoE trapped means they control her. But JoE doesn't need control of the situation to turn it against them. She only needs one mistake, one weak moment, one moment when the Russians think they have finally broken her. And if that happens, Episode 5 could turn from a rescue mission into something much more dangerous. Because JoE escaping on her own would mean the CIA is no longer searching for a helpless prisoner. They would be searching for an operative who has already started fighting her way back. And that could create a completely different problem. JoE may get out, but getting out is only the beginning. The real question is whether she can survive long enough to find out why the Russians wanted her alive in the first place. Think about JoE's situation right now. She knows she has been captured. She knows the Russians have information about her. And she knows that somewhere outside that room, the CIA is trying to locate her. But what JoE doesn't know is exactly how much the Russians already know. That is the dangerous part. Every question they ask her could reveal something. Every person who enters the room could reveal something. Every movement could give JoE another piece of the puzzle. The Russians may think they are studying JoE, but JoE is studying them too. She will notice who is nervous, who is confident, who gives orders, who waits for instructions, and who seems to know more than they should. JoE understands how intelligence operations work, and that makes her one of the worst people to keep alive in captivity. Because even when she is trapped, her mind is still working. And I think that is exactly how her escape could begin. JoE probably won't escape by simply overpowering every guard in front of her. That would be too easy and it would not fit the way the storyline has been building. Instead, I think JoE will make the Russians believe that she is becoming easier to control. Maybe she stops fighting back. Maybe she gives them small pieces of information. Maybe she starts acting exhausted and makes them believe that the pressure is finally working. But that could all be part of the plan. JoE knows that people become careless when they believe they have already won. The moment the Russians stop seeing her as an immediate threat could become the moment JoE becomes most dangerous. She doesn't need a perfect opportunity. She just needs an imperfect one. A guard gets distracted. A door stays open a little too long. Her location changes. A transfer begins. A vehicle moves. And suddenly JoE has something she didn't have before. Movement. And movement creates uncertainty. This is why I think a transfer could be the key to JoE's escape in Episode 5. Keeping someone locked inside a secure location is one thing. Moving that person is completely different. Suddenly there are more people involved. More communication. More vehicles. More chances for something to go wrong. And JoE knows that. She could spend hours studying the routine of her captors just waiting for that exact moment. She doesn't need to know everything about the building. She doesn't need to know where the nearest road is. She only needs to understand what happens when they move her. Who checks the vehicle? Who sits beside her? Who opens the door? What happens if she becomes sick? What happens if she refuses to move? What happens if two guards disagree? These tiny details could become the difference between captivity and freedom. And here's the part that makes this theory even more interesting. JoE may not actually want to escape immediately. She may first want to understand why the Russians are keeping her alive. Because if they only wanted information, they could have treated her very differently. If they only wanted to eliminate her, there would be no reason to keep her alive for this long. So what is the real objective? That question could become the center of Episode 5. Maybe JoE realizes that she isn't the final target. Maybe her capture is designed to force the CIA to react. The Russians could be watching every move the Americans make. Who is sent to find her? How quickly do they respond? Which communication channels become active? Who takes control of the rescue? JoE's captivity could actually be part of a much larger intelligence operation. And that means Kyle's role becomes extremely important. Kyle wants to find JoE, but emotion can become dangerous in a mission like this. If the Russians understand how important JoE is to him, they could use that against him. They could give him information that looks real. They could make him believe JoE is running out of time. They could create a situation where Kyle feels he has no choice but to move quickly. And if Kyle rushes into the wrong location, he could expose the rescue operation. But there is another possibility. Kyle could realize that the information being given to him is designed to manipulate him. If he understands that, the entire operation could change. Instead of following the Russians' plan, he could start using their expectations against them. And that could eventually lead him closer to JoE. But what if JoE escapes before that happens? Imagine JoE finally gets a chance to break away. She creates confusion, gets outside and disappears before the rescue team arrives. First, this would sound like a victory, but JoE would immediately face another problem. She may have no idea where she is. She could be injured. She could have no weapon. She could have no reliable communication. And she may not even know whether the people looking for her are actually there to save her. That last part is especially important, because if JoE suspects there is a leak inside the CIA, then seeing American personnel would not automatically make her feel safe, could make her even more suspicious. JoE knows that enemy intelligence services can use false information, false identities, and manipulation. So if she sees people claiming to be American operatives, she is not going to simply walk toward them. She will watch them first. She will listen. She will look for something only the real team should know. And that could create one of the most tense moments of the episode. JoE is hiding somewhere, watching the rescue team from a distance, while Kyle and the others believe they are finally close to finding her. They don't know she is already there. JoE doesn't know whether she can trust them. Both sides are looking for each other, but neither side understands the full situation. And this is where the betrayal theory could become even bigger. What if JoE discovers that the Russians did not need a traditional mole inside the CIA? What if the information they have came from something much more complicated? A compromised device, a careless conversation, a captured asset, a communication mistake, a surveillance operation. One small weakness could have created a chain of information that eventually led directly to JoE. That would be terrifying because it would mean the CIA might spend the entire season searching for a traitor who doesn't actually exist. JoE could be the first person to understand that the enemy has learned how to exploit the system itself. If JoE escapes with that knowledge, she could become more dangerous than she was before her capture. Because now she has seen the enemy from the inside. She has heard their questions. She has watched their behavior. She knows what they seem to know and, more importantly, she knows what they don't know. That information could help Caitlin understand what is really happening. But there is also a chance JoE refuses to immediately trust Caitlin. And that could create a powerful conflict between them. Because JoE may come home physically alive but mentally changed. She may start asking questions that nobody wants to answer. Who knew where she was going? Who knew about the operation? Who knew the Russians were watching? Why were they prepared for certain CIA moves? Why was JoE targeted in the first place? And if the answers don't make sense, JoE may decide that waiting for an official investigation is too dangerous. She could start investigating on her own. That is why I don't think JoE's escape would end her storyline. It could actually begin the most dangerous part of it. If she gets away before the CIA reaches her, then the Russians lose control of their prisoner, but the CIA also loses control of the rescue operation. Everyone suddenly has incomplete information. JoE is somewhere out there trying to survive. Kyle is trying to locate her. Caitlin is trying to understand the larger operation. And the Russians are trying to figure out how their carefully planned mission went wrong. That creates chaos on every side. And chaos is exactly where JoE is most dangerous. She doesn't need an army. She doesn't need perfect information. She only needs enough information to make the next move. If she can stay hidden long enough, she could begin following the trail back toward the people responsible for her capture. And here's my biggest theory for episode 5. JoE may discover something during her escape that the CIA would never have found from the outside. Maybe she hears a name. Maybe she recognizes a location. Maybe she notices that one of her captors reacts strangely when a certain person is mentioned. One tiny detail could connect everything. Suddenly JoE's escape becomes more than survival. It becomes an investigation. And if that happens, the Russians may realize that letting JoE live was their biggest mistake. Because they didn't just capture an operative. They gave that operative a chance to see how they work. There is also another possibility that could make the ending of episode 5 even more shocking. What if JoE escapes, but instead of immediately contacting the CIA, she stays hidden? First, that would seem like a strange decision. But JoE may have a reason. If she believes someone inside the operation is compromised, contacting the CIA could reveal her location to the enemy all over again. So she could decide that the safest person to trust is no one. Not even the people coming to save her. That would put JoE completely on her own. And imagine what that means for Kyle. He could finally get close to her location, only to discover that JoE doesn't want to be rescued yet. She may tell him that something is wrong. She may warn him that the Russians wanted the CIA to come looking for her. And suddenly Kyle has to choose between following orders and trusting JoE's instincts. That could become the emotional heart of the episode. Because Kyle knows JoE better than most people. But captivity may have changed what JoE is willing to believe. And if JoE tells him, don't trust anyone, then the entire rescue mission changes. Now here's the question I keep coming back to. Why would the Russians allow JoE to survive long enough to escape? Maybe they don't. Maybe JoE escaping is actually something they never expected. Maybe the whole operation depends on controlling her, and the moment she gets free, everything begins falling apart. If that is true, then JoE's escape could expose just how fragile the Russian plan really was. But there is one final possibility that could completely flip this story. What if JoE escaping is exactly what the Russians wanted? What if they intentionally give her a path out because they know where she will go afterward? What if the real goal isn't keeping JoE captive but following her once she gets free? That would turn JoE's escape into another trap. She may believe she has finally escaped, only to realize that someone is still tracking her. And if she leads them directly back to the CIA, then the rescue operation becomes a weapon against the people trying to save her. That is the kind of twist Lioness could pull off. So going into episode 5, I don't think the biggest question is simply whether JoE survives. I think the bigger question is whether JoE understands the game before the Russians make their next move. If she escapes before Kyle reaches her, she could become the one controlling the situation. But if the escape is part of a larger plan, JoE could be walking directly into another trap. And if JoE finally makes it back to the Americans, I don't think she will simply hug everyone and move on. I think she will have one question. Who knew? Who knew where she was going? Who knew she would be targeted? Who knew the Russians were ready? And who knew enough to make her capture possible? Because if JoE finds that answer, then episode 5 won't just be about a rescue. It will be about the beginning of a much bigger war inside the intelligence operation. And that's why I think the final moments could be brutal. JoE could finally appear in front of Kyle and Caitlin. Everyone thinks the nightmare is over. Kyle believes he has finally brought her home. Caitlin believes they can finally start figuring out what happened. But JoE doesn't look relieved. She looks worried. She knows something they don't. Maybe she tells them the Russians were not trying to kill her. Maybe she tells them they were waiting for someone. Or maybe she simply says, "You shouldn't have come for me." And if that happens, then we know JoE's escape was never the real ending. It was the beginning. So what do you think? Will JoE really escape the Russians before the CIA rescue team reaches her? Or will her escape turn out to be another part of the Russian plan? And if JoE discovers that someone inside the operation helped the enemy, will she trust Kyle and Caitlin when they finally find her? Drop your theory in the comments, because if JoE escapes on her own in episode 5, I don't think the rescue will be the end of her story. It could be the moment when JoE finally realizes that the person she needs to fight may not be outside the CIA. It may be much closer to home.